the driveway that wasn't theirs. I never thought a strip of cracked asphalt could turn my life upside down. But that's exactly what happened the year my husband Mark and I bought our first house in Maple Hollow, a quiet little town tucked into the hills of eastern Ohio. We thought we were buying a fresh start. What we actually bought was a front row seat to the most exhausting standoff of our lives. Let me back up. 4 years, Mark and I rented a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store downtown. We saved every spare dollar, skipped vacations, ate a lot of spaghetti, and dreamed about the day we'd finally have a yard big enough for our 2 dogs, Bear and Daisy, to actually run instead of just pace in circles. When we found the listing for a corner lot on Hazelwood Lane, it felt like fate. Mature oak trees, a wraparound porch that needed some love but had good bones, and a price that for once didn't make us choke on our coffee. The house had belonged to the same family for almost 60 years before it finally hit the market. One detail stood out during the walkthrough: the property had 2 separate points of access. A gravel road curled around to the back of the lot, useful for hauling firewood or parking a trailer. But there was also a paved lane running tight along the side of the house, squeezed between our property and the house next door. Our realtor mentioned it almost as an afterthought. "There's a shared access easement on that side lane," she said, flipping through a folder of paperwork. "Goes back decades. Should be no big deal, just something to know about." We didn't think much of it. Mark actually laughed and said, "As long as nobody's trying to steal our mail, I don't care who uses a driveway." We were wrong. Spectacularly wrong. Moving day and the first red flag. The day the moving truck pulled up, I noticed our new next-door neighbor watching from her porch. She was maybe in her 60s, arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. I waved. She didn't wave back. I figured she was just having a bad morning. A few days later, once boxes were unpacked enough that I could find my own shoes, I decided to introduce myself properly. I baked a batch of lemon bars, my grandmother's recipe, the kind that always smooths things over, and walked next door. Her name was Carol. Her grown son, Dustin, lived with her and came outside when he heard voices. "Hi, I'm Jenna," I said, holding out the plate. "We just moved in." I wanted to say hello and also mention, we looked over the property survey, and we know the side driveway is a shared easement. We're totally fine with that. We just want to be good neighbors and keep things easy for everyone. I thought that was a kind, reasonable thing to say. I thought it would smooth the path forward. Instead, Carol's face went tight, like I'd just told her I was repossessing her car. "No," she said flatly. "That driveway is ours. Always has been." I actually laughed, thinking she was joking. She was not joking. "I have a copy of the survey if you'd like to see it," I offered. "I'm not trying to start anything. I just want us to be on the same page." Dustin took the paper from my hands, glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds, and handed it back like it was contaminated. "These papers are wrong," he said. I stood there on their porch holding a plate of lemon bars, completely stunned. How do you respond to someone telling you that an official recorded property survey is incorrect simply because they don't like what it says? I didn't have a comeback. I just said something polite and awkward and walked back home, lemon bars and all. That 5-minute conversation set the tone for the next year of our lives, the slow-motion siege. At first it was small things. Annoying but small. Every single time Mark or I needed to use the side lane, to bring in lawn equipment, to access the side yard, to do literally anything, there was a vehicle parked right at the entrance. Not in front of their house where there was plenty of open curb space. Not down the block. Always exactly at the mouth of the shared lane, blocking it just enough to make using it a hassle. Our town has wide streets and 0 parking restrictions. Carol and Dustin had at least 40 feet of curb directly in front of their own house. They could have parked anywhere. They chose, every time, the one spot guaranteed to be in our way. I told myself it was a coincidence. The 3rd time I stopped believing that. Then one Saturday morning I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I looked out the window and there was a small paving crew setting up cones beside our property line. No notice. No knock on the door. No phone call. Nothing. I went outside in my pajamas, hair a disaster, and asked Carol what on earth was going on. She smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Oh, we're just finally fixing our driveway." Our driveway. I stood there for a second, genuinely speechless, watching strangers repave a strip of asphalt that was, according to the county recorder's office, sitting almost entirely on our side of the property line. That was the moment something shifted in me. I went from, "let's keep the peace," to, "I need to start protecting myself." Building a paper trail. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I'm the woman who apologizes to inanimate objects when I bump into them. But something about watching a construction crew claim part of my own yard lit a fire I didn't know I had. I started documenting everything. Photos with timestamps. Videos. Copies of the deed, the survey, the original easement agreement from the county archive. I made digital folders and backed them up twice. I figured if this ever escalated, and at this point I had a bad feeling it would, I wanted a paper trail thick enough to stop an argument before it started. Good thing I did, because next came the phone calls. Carol began filing complaints with the township office, claiming our dogs were trespassing on her property. The property in question was our own fenced side yard. Fenced, mind you, well within our property line, confirmed by the same survey she insisted was fake. An animal control officer eventually came out, looked at the property map, looked at our fence, looked at Carol's house, and left looking like he'd just been asked to referee a fight over nothing. I don't think he found a single thing wrong. I half expected an apology from Carol after that. I did not get one. Dustin and the dogs. If Carol's approach was bureaucratic warfare, Dustin's approach was something else entirely. Every time I walked Bear and Daisy anywhere near the side lane, he appeared. Like clockwork. Sometimes he'd just stand at the property line, arms crossed, staring in total silence, which honestly was almost creepier than if he'd said something. Other times he'd shout things under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear but not quite loud enough to be clearly threatening. And sometimes, this is the part that really got under my skin, he'd walk close enough to the fence on purpose, fast, with sudden movements specifically to startle the dogs into barking. Bear and Daisy are good dogs. We train them. They're not aggressive, they don't lunge, they don't snap at people. But they're dogs. If someone marches at a fence line waving their arms, they're going to bark. That's not a behavioral problem, that's just being a dog. The first few times, I genuinely thought maybe Dustin just wasn't a dog person and was nervous around them. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for months. I kept telling myself, don't escalate, don't give them a reason to call this normal conflict instead of harassment. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I was in the side yard with both dogs, just doing some gardening, minding my business, when Dustin walked directly up to the fence and started waving both arms over his head while yelling something I genuinely couldn't make out. The dogs, understandably, lost it, barking, jumping at the fence line. And Dustin pulled out his phone. He started filming. Calmly. Almost gleefully. Like he'd been waiting all afternoon for exactly this moment. I knew immediately what he was doing. He wasn't documenting a dangerous situation. He was manufacturing one. He wanted footage that made it look like our dogs were the problem, when he was the one who'd walked up and provoked them on purpose. That night I sat down across from Mark at our kitchen table and said the words I'd been holding back for almost a year. I'm done. Not angry. Not yelling. Just done. Tired in a way that goes all the way to your bones. Tired of the parked cars. Tired of the fake complaints. Tired of pretending that two people determined to be unreasonable would eventually just stop. The real question nobody wants to answer. Here's the part that still keeps me up some nights. The original shared access agreement, the one written up roughly 80 years ago when both properties belonged to the same extended family, is still technically valid. Back then, that lane led to a small workshop and a storage shed on what's now Carol and Dustin's side of the property. Those buildings don't exist anymore. They were torn down years before we ever showed up, back when the family expanded their own main driveway. Which leaves an honest, uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Does this easement even serve a real purpose anymore? Or is everyone just fighting over the idea of a driveway that hasn't actually been needed in decades? Some days I daydream about putting up a tasteful privacy fence right along the property line, reclaiming our side yard completely, planting something pretty along it, and just being done with the whole thing forever. Mark and I have even priced out fencing contractors just in case. But mostly I don't want a fence. I don't want a lawsuit. I don't want county officials driving out here every other month with confused looks on their faces. I just want quiet. When we bought this house, I pictured slow Sunday mornings on that porch swing. Backyard barbecues with friends. The dogs flopped out in the grass after a long run. I did not picture spending my evenings cross-referencing deed records or learning the proper way to timestamp a video for a potential legal case. And yet here we are. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the driveway was never really the problem. A few feet of pavement isn't worth losing sleep over. The real problem is trying to share a fence line with people who can't accept that something legally, clearly, on paper isn't theirs, and would rather make your life difficult than simply admit it. We're still here. Still neighbors technically. Still documenting everything just in case. But every single day I get a little better at letting the small stuff go, and a little more determined to protect the things that actually matter.